Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 2020 Folk Film Gathering, which is taking place entirely for free online this year. This is the first of a series of discussions that we are hopefully going to be doing from here on at the Folk Film Gathering, where we're inviting some of the filmmakers who are showing films in this year's edition to come together and explore the ways in which their approaches to filmmaking kind of may find resonances with each other, resonances and also differences. We're very honored today to have with us Nadir Bouhmouch from Morocco, whose magnificent documentary Amusu is screening in our program this year. And we're also very honored to have several members of the Amber Collective from the northeast of England, whose equally magnificent documentary From Us to Me is screening alongside their drama film Like Father. Now, both Nadir and Amber, for those unfamiliar with their work, share an interest in working with communities, making films in such a way which is kind of in very direct conversation with communities, and as a result of kind of very long-term, embedded and deeply considered relationships with that community. And both Nadir and Amber are also interested in the ways in which filmmaking as a process can be collective and kind of involve more than just the single voice of the kind of the auteur director, but rather can have a sense of multiple voices and a sense of participation. So in the session today, we're going to be exploring both some of the resonances and the kind of differences and divergences in their work in two very different parts of the world, but nonetheless, I feel there is a lot of commonality. Maybe you guys can tell me if you agree or not. But the purpose of the session is to get a conversation going between filmmakers. Myself and my colleague Will Higby from the University of Exeter are here just to provide kind of questions and prompts and provocations, but ultimately we're hoping that the conversation will largely be between the filmmakers. So I thought maybe we could get started with a question for you, Nadir, and I'll ask the same question to Ellie, Pete and Circa from Amber about just firstly how you go about building your relationships with the communities that you film with. I think there's a very interesting sense in both your work, Nadir, and in the work of Amber of liminality, of a kind of a blurred sense of insider outsider, a sense of are you part of the community? Are you outside of it filming in? Are you inside filming out? Is it a bit of both? And so, yeah, could you maybe tell us, Nadir, about how you go about maybe perhaps with Amusu in particular, but please feel free to talk about other films that you've made as well, how you go about building those relationships with the communities that you work with?
Thanks a lot, by the way, for this. This is just really great to be in conversation with Amber. I've heard a lot of Amber for a few years now, so this is yesterday I finally got the chance to sit down and watch a few films. My experience isn't as there isn't as much breadth to it, of course, as Amber. So I'll just be talking about my experience with. I've only had 3 films that you could say were made collectively. Well, actually, all the films, but where I'm engaging with the people who are in front of the camera and they actually have power over how they're represented. So only actually a short film, Amusu, and a documentary series called Paradises of the Earth, which I shot in the mining basin, the phosphate mining basin in Tunisia. But I think Amusu is the most representative of how I think it's closer to the way I would like to continue working. It's I think the result of several years of reflecting on how to engage with communities, and I think it's also a very unique opportunity that I had. I don't think I'll have many opportunities like it again, in the sense that it was a community that was already so well organized, that had already recognized the need for images and culture to document their struggle, and to preserve its memory for future generations. So it was actually not very difficult for me to work with them on this film. But I guess how things started is I began as a militant, working with them as a militant. I had no idea that I would be filming a musu. So I started just translating statements for them in English so that they could be read abroad, helping them with their message, with their international messaging, media campaigns online, things like this. So I was already working with them in my capacity as an activist before I started working on the film. And then there was this mutual. It was a few weeks before the climate change conference that was held here in Marrakesh, that they had approached me about making a short film about it's called 300 Kilometers South. And they wanted me to make this short film as a counter-propaganda video because one of the main sponsors of the climate change conference was Managem Corporation, the mining corporation that's polluting their land and over-extracting their water. So they wanted to use this video and put it on YouTube, and basically as a form of counter-propaganda. And then from that, we decided that we're going to go ahead with making. So we decided collectively. And the reason why I said it was so easy earlier is because the way they're organized reflects, ideologically, reflects how I like to approach things, or how I would like to approach things. In the sense that they already have these general assemblies called agrao, and agrao is this indigenous form of democracy. It's horizontal. It's before colonialism. That's how communities were making decisions. So agrao became the producer. So agrao includes everybody in the community, even children, have a say in these assemblies. So agrao becomes the main producer of the film. So the decision instead of going to the state and asking them for a permit to shoot there, I go to the community. And then in that sense, even though I'm making a film about something like Managem, which is a corporation owned by the royal holding, so it's very powerful corporation, I was still protected, and they couldn't stop. The police couldn't really stop me because the community was able to take me in, to make the project its own. And if it wasn't the community's project, it would never have succeeded. I think I kind of diverged there, but I hope I answered a little bit your question.
Thanks, Nadir. Yeah, no, that was great. Can I invite Amber? Pete, you had your hand up. You need to switch your microphone on.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, it's interesting that. Does that mean, Nadir, that your relationship with the community really kind of has priority over the state, or over the kind of did you call it the royal the royal prerogative, or whatever term you used? So they can actually make a decision which would, even if it displeased the authorities, that you could still go ahead because you had the approval of the community.
Exactly, because in Morocco you have to have permits to shoot anything. It's not about getting permits to just block a street. It's about, if you want to make a film, you need a permit to beforehand to shoot. You need a production company, which we don't have. you need and then you need also a permit to screen. So there's several blocks on the way. So we just get rid of all those blocks and we go straight to the community. Say, you want this film? Yes, no, okay, you want it? Let's do it. It's Otherwise, if we kept waiting, if we our there's no reason necessarily working with the state on a topic like this, or getting funding from the state, or getting approval from the state, because then they would never approve it.
It's interesting that it just reminds me of the kind of problems that have developed in recent years, you know, which are very different situation from when we first started, and that was working with people who maybe appear without their knowledge or without actual permission. Nowadays, it becomes less and less possible to do anything without having written authority from people you are representing.
Exactly. I feel as a filmmaker as if I'm filling out more and more forms and application forms and grant forms than I am actually spending time making films or creating. I think David Graeber talks about this in Bullshit Jobs. I don't know if
Yes. I'll turn this off for a moment.
Ellie, go on. Yeah, you got a question?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's really true what Peter says, that in the past, I mean, we didn't obviously have that organizational situation that you have with the community having its own organization. That would have been great, but I mean, the equivalence to that, I suppose, in our situation would be the trade unions or you know, community groups that we were working with, and if you had the go ahead from them, we never even used to bother doing release forms or anything like that in the early films that we made, because we had I mean, often it's similar to what you said, is that the initial contact or the initial film material that we might have shot would have been at the request of the community or the community group or the campaign, so that often it worked that way around, which sounds quite similar to what that situation you've had with Amusu, that there's a problem, that a community has a problem, or there's a campaign. We've had contact with them in the past for, you know, because there are long-term relationships, and then the community will come to us and say, look, this is going on, will you come and film it? And then that might develop later into another much longer or more considered piece, but by then you've already established the relationships, you know, with the people, because you've come at their request. So it's
Ellie, can I just building on that, could you give us some examples of moments in Amber's history where you've been approached by a community to make a film about something in particular?
well, yeah, I mean, it's happened, you know, quite a number of times. I mean, well, we go back to for instance, Sequel, the film we made, which was our first kind of experiment with you know, a feature film, a drama, full-length drama, but that began with a relationship that we had with the Sequelers, the Sequel community, photography projects, I think, originally, but we'd always had an idea that it would be great because we knew about this community, and we thought that it would make a great subject for a film. But initially, what happened was that they had a crisis in their community where their access to the beach had been blocked off, so they couldn't work, they couldn't get down to get their coal off the beach, which is how they lived, with horses, you know, collecting the coal from the sea. And the person who owned the beach, who was also a coal contractor in his own right, blocked the entrances. So their livelihood was stopped overnight, and they came to us and said, will you come and do something about this so we can publicize this? So we went and did some filming, and I mean, that's just one example, but I mean, the miners' strike obviously is another one in Easington where we're working a lot. That we had relationships there, again through current affairs sort of documentaries that we made, and then there were requests that the miners needed to get their message out because their message wasn't getting out in the mainstream media. So we made little videos that could be used as campaign videos between mining communities that could be sent so that people could get to understand what was happening in different communities. I mean, there's lots of examples. Yeah.
Thanks, Eddie. Great. So I guess another question then, which kind of grows very naturally out of all of that, is just how interested in exploring kind of some of the details of these kind of the creative working relationships that you both then have with the communities that you're working with, and how that community's voice, for want of a better word, is factored in to the creative process. I guess both at the point where you are conceiving of the film and developing it, and then at the point where you're actually shooting it, the point where you're editing it, and then I guess even at the point where you're then exhibiting it and distributing it. And maybe we could go back to Nadir first on this. And Nadir, I know you've written about this aspect of the process, but it would be great just to kind of hear from you in detail just about how exactly, because one of the things I'm interested in, Nadir, is the credits in your film. You know, you explicitly say at the start, you say, I can't remember the exact wording, but you say this is a film by the Imidir community. And so and that's the first thing that I believe that we see in the film. And then at the end of the film, you have this kind of dual thing where your name comes up first. You say a film by Nadir, but kind of prompted by, and in conversation with the community. So I was just wondering if you could give us some of the details, the kind of the more granular details of how that process worked.
Well, basically, once Agrao, the General Assembly, approved, said, okay, let's do this film, because it was an initiative that was started by some of the village youth, and so they themselves, and they were the youth that I was in contact with for a couple of years before that. So once they had their idea, they proposed it to the General Assembly, to the Agrao, and then the Agrao, once it was approved, appointed what they call the local film committee of Imeda, and this is sort of like the production branch that follows the day-to-day. So it's a collective. How do I put this? It's a different type of collective from the one that from collectives like Amber. In the sense that it's not a group of filmmakers that are getting together and then working with communities as a collective, but it's basically a temporary collective that one filmmaker can create with a community. Although I would like to also be a collective of filmmakers working with the community, but right now in Morocco, there isn't, as we say in Arabic, there's no one to work with in this sense. No one that's not true. There's not no one, but very few people at this stage. But I'm diverting again, as I usually do. And then they also formed writing committees, writing agros, so General Assemblies for writing, agros for montage as well. And there were a lot of workshops with the community, showing them, basically I call it demystifying the apparatus. So putting the equipment on the ground and saying, here it is, let's use it together, let's play with it. And I think this concept of play played a big role in production of the film, in the creation of, you'll have the children actually run off with the camera and take a few photos here and there, and that actually might inspire you later, but it also helps because now the children don't care about the camera anymore. They've already played with it. So when you set up the camera, they don't even look at it anymore. They know what it is. It doesn't, especially when you look at, and it's important to remember that our relationship with the camera is not the same one as what you would find in the UK, in the sense that as a colonized people, our first contact with cameras came through colonialism. So you had the first time our grandparents saw a camera was, well, there was a line of légionnaires, French legionnaires, and right behind them you had the cameramen, the propagandists. And so we quickly came to recognize, I think, collective memory that cameras were something that was foreign to us, that was alien to us, that was used for amassing power for a certain group of people. So the idea about demystifying this apparatus is taking it down and letting it be something that's futile, that's no longer alien in a community like this. Because in this region in particular, it would be very difficult to actually film women in the way that I did. So the fact that women were allowing me to film them, allowing me into their space, like it was, this is all the result of collective work, collective trust, the fact that they had a say in writing, in the editing, because we would screen rough cuts and they would give me feedback, because Murray says this in Pursuit of Happiness, when he says, you know, that moment when the community says that's it, that's the they're with you. So to build to that moment, I mean, if there wasn't the agreos for montage, we wouldn't have gotten to that moment where they say, okay, this is something that reflects us. So there was I'm trying to summarize, because there was a lot of things. There were the workshops. There was the Environmental Justice Film Festival, where they were going to watch, because they were used to watching TV, not creative documentary. So screening film so that they could. So that I'm not saying, okay, look, this is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to do. They can easily tell me, no, in that film they did it this way. Why do you do it that way? So it also allows them, gives them the power to tell me, no, it's a check on my own authority as director, which is a term I question in itself. Anyway, this is just a quick overview. I have like, my mind kind of goes in many different directions at the same time. I don't know if I'm clear sometimes when I'm talking.
Wonderfully clear, Nadir. Thank you very much. Pete, do you want to respond?
Just a question. I mean, we watched a couple of your films. We watched Amusu, of course, but we also watched. Oh, Serka wants to talk about
yes,
this.
She
wants
please?
to ask my question.
Because I guess what you're going to ask. We watched the 475 film, and I was absolutely knocked sideways and in tears at the end of it. A very powerful film. And I was wondering how you collaborated with the women. Obviously, it feels almost like a woman's film. It's taking the women's viewpoint very strongly. But also, I mean, it is an amazing look at all the different layers and levels of patriarchy that result in everybody being colluding in the same outcomes, which are absolutely horrendous, but seems like everybody's entrapped in the culture or the patriarchy, basically, which is what your conclusion is. But what an amazing story. And I wondered how much the women, I mean, first of all, for you to have that access, was the cameraman Hamza, director of photography, was that? Who was the photographer there? Wasn't a woman, was it? Or was it? I can't tell.
This was it's not my favorite film, because there's a lot of problematic things about it. But I think what saved it, because I was one of these people that said, I'm not a feminist, but I support women's rights kind of person, right before I made that film. And luckily I met a friend, Huda al-Muqaddam, who's the narrator. And she's the one, I think, that, well, she was my first feminist theory professor in the process of making the film. Believe it or not, this is really a film that I have a lot of issues with, because I don't think I was the one that should have made it. I see its value in the time that it was made, but retrospectively, I think Huda should have been more should have been a co-director at least with me. So I have many regrets about that film, actually.
We wondered how big a role she had, because it was her story also, and she
Yeah,
wasn't the narrator.
exactly.
And you are credited as an editor, so I guess a lot of the narrative structure came from that, and the juxtapositions towards the end between the revealing how the parents actually had colluded in this, and what the father's story was completely different from his second wife's story, and the juxtapositions really create narrative.
So, to answer your question about the camera, it's actually very funny because about the story with the father, and so the story with the father is the one that the media all over Morocco was usually following, and we were falling into the same trap. So I was, I mean, you don't realize you're doing these things sometimes as a man, where we were basically we had two women members of the team, and we went with the couple to the graveyard, the man and wife, and so it was all the men that went to the graveyard, and two women, Huda and Amina, stayed behind with the second wife, and we had no idea the story about the second wife, and the second wife just starts spilling it to them, and they start recording with the phone. So that whole thing, I have no part in it. It was something that if we were there as men, this is why I said I don't think it was my role to be the one, because apparently our presence as men was the story itself, that we were not going to find something like that if it wasn't for Huda and Amina. But I also I wanted to ask you about the Today I'm With You. Absolutely amazing. I mean, I just I'm planning a photography project for what I needed to see. Just the way that it you see the community in two different time periods, how there's this dialectic in the process, in her process, that I don't know how to explain it. What I'm wondering is, could you tell me a little bit more about how she made contact with the community initially? I mean, how a little bit more about her work.
You're talking about me.
Yeah, it's about you. I'm sorry. I didn't recognize you.
I can answer for it, of course. And through patriarchal just
No, but really, I would love, besides this conversation, to sit down and have a Skype session later, because I really would. I watched it with a friend yesterday, and we were just both, the photographs are amazing.
Maybe I could just ask a question there, Serka, about just how, because I'm aware in Today I'm With You kind of document aspects of your very collaborative process with those photographs, and about how you very much devised the framing, what was in the shots, kind of in conversation with the people that were in the photographs, which I think is very resonant with a lot of the things that Nadir is saying about Amusu. Could you tell us a little bit about that process, about the kind of collaborative and
Time round in 1969, I actually came to live in Baika. So I was living in that community, the original community, for 7 years, and then the whole neighborhood pulled down, and everybody had to move out. The whole community, basically, as a community, was dispersed, and very few came back to the new estate, although it was supposed to have been built for them. There were a lot of technical problems with the rolling program of pulling down old houses and building new ones. The gap became too long. The original community was lost. But in the first community, it wasn't that common for people still to have their own cameras, and there wasn't any social media. There was no fear of having the images abused in any way. So I was just communicating directly with the people I photographed and I lived with. And if they wanted me to take a photograph down from I had a little studio in a hairdressing salon in the shop window this ongoing exhibition, and if somebody said, like an old lady came and said, I don't want you to have my picture in the window, and I would ask why, and she would say, well, I'm wearing an apron, I don't like it. And I would try and argue, you know, like vanity didn't really kind of wasn't a good enough reason for me. I would explain I wanted real life, you know, how people really lived, and she looked beautiful and so on. But later on she came and told me, well, that wasn't the real reason. The real reason is that I'm there with my grandchild and I'm protecting her from the father. I don't want our whereabouts to be known. So I then immediately took it down and I said I will never use it. And then 5, 10, 6 years later, I saw her again and she said, oh, things are fine now. You can use it. I would love you to use it. Put it in your book. So it was that kind of a relationship then. Then 25 years passed before I went back to bike, and I was invited back because I had left my original exhibition there and it was well used to introduce new people to the community. And the new community at that point in 2003 became one of the reception centres in UK for asylum seekers, mainly from the African continent, but from the Middle East and elsewhere. And it had a huge impact on the community. And the community workers were saying to me that you should come back now because there's a lot happening here now. It's real time of change, and it's very interesting too. So I spent a year actually going around doing research first to make sure that I could tell a good story. There were a lot of problems prior to that moment, which I was aware of in the community, you know, a lot of social problems and some architectural problems with the new estate as well. And I didn't want to tell a story of misery. I think all of my work actually stems from a desire to celebrate either an individual or a community. In fact, all of my work is inspired by communities without me having even thought of it until I look back on it. I see each one of them have. And so I wanted to be inspired before I would embark on this new project. And eventually I heard that there were people there who absolutely loved the new estate. They weren't the same people who'd been in the old community, but the new people living there loved it and felt passionate about it. And it is quite an extraordinary social housing project in its own right. So then once I decided to start, I could not continue at all in the same vein as I had photographed in the old biker, because the world had changed beyond measure, and there was social media and everybody was very aware of cameras, questioning. You don't have the right to photograph children without the parents' written permission, for instance. You couldn't photograph schools, you couldn't, very much more restricted, whereas in the first community I could walk anywhere, anytime, and would be invited in people's homes, could photograph children anywhere. There was no worries. So gradually I realized the only way to make this project happen was as a truly kind of collaborative process initially, so that I would spend a lot of time meeting the people, talking to them, swapping stories. They would get to know me, I would get to know them. I mean, actually, the first big step was I was invited to be part of asylum seeker support group, which I then was part of for 3 years. Every Friday, cooking with the women from Africa for the whole asylum seeker community. And I got to know virtually every asylum seeker family that was invited during those years. And as an extension of that, I would then put this idea of my project to them, which was to get to know the new people who live in Bike now. What was the just to see, well, just to jump another, few months of development, I realized what I could do through this project was, in a way, introduce people to one another, because it's a very small area geographically. It's only two square kilometers, and demographically it's hugely diverse. And there is no single community. There are lots of small pockets of communities there, and they live side by side, door to door, and they don't know each other. They see them by sight in the street, but they don't know anything more about them. So I thought I could get people to introduce themselves and put this question to them. If you had just one picture to introduce yourself to the rest of, to your neighbor, first of all, and to the rest of the world, what would you have in it? And it became like a game where people could think, you know, what, just one picture to tell the world who I am. And then we would work around that idea, and we would gradually, I would maybe have one or two goals first and look at the pictures, and then develop ideas further from that. And finally, we would have like the tableau sort of set up with the camera there and lighting. I wanted to give beautiful lighting, you know, give real dignity, real possibility of a beautiful portrait, but without people just looking at the camera. I hate that kind of portraiture. So then I wanted something to happen spontaneously in front of the camera, that I would be there ready to snap. So that final moment was authentic to the people I was photographing. They gave me something that I had no idea what it would be necessarily, and it would surprise me. And but I was already set up for it. So that was the process. And then I would literally carry those prints around with me and to the next person. And I started getting lots of introductions. I could have gone on. I went on for 6 years and I photographed 100 families. And I could have gone on for another 6. I really had to call a stop because we were also committed to making the film and the book and everything. The deadlines kind of crashed in on us. But yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Serka. We've got a question queued up. Before we come to that, Nadir, did you have something that you wanted to ask Serka about what she just said there?
Can't hear.
Nadir, I don't think your microphone's on, Nadir.
No, microphone is not on.
I just wanted to say about one of the things that I really found touching about the film was that moment where you're showing them the pictures and introducing them to each other. I wanted to ask you a little bit about exhibition, how you exhibited maybe the first. Did you exhibit in the community? How did you exhibit the first photos from the? How did you go about the second one?
The first community, I had lots of small exhibitions within Baika itself, and the first one, of course, was my studio window, which was right on the shopping street by a bus stop, so people could see. And I had my dark room there, so I would every day put new pictures up. And then there was one in the shop store, and then there was a Baika festival, Newcastle festival in Newcastle. So it gradually sort of went further and further. And of course, I did get a national award quite early on for the work. So then the press and media basically, the whole project became known to everyone in Baika and beyond. So that was kind of quite sort of organic, the way that progressed. And I would always give prints to everyone I photographed for free. And that was one of the things that sort of baffled people in Baika. They said, how the hell do you make a living? You know, I had like a studio, I was taking portraits as well, and then just giving the prints. Nobody paid for anything. I did get a small arts grant, little bit, tiny bit to begin with, and then the council let me rent the old hairdressing salon for free, because Baika was already beginning to be emptied for the redevelopment. So I had little bits to help, and of course, being member of AMBA, being part of the AMBA collective, we pooled everything we earned from any kind of a commercial job. and then we each took a small wage out of it, the minimum wage we could survive on. And that went on like for 40 years. We always, so if I wasn't earning enough, somebody else, like Peter was doing a lot of commercial work for television, and he would bring in a good wage, and that was shared by everyone. So it was possible to survive on very little and concentrate on work that we, were our passion projects. And so that was the first time. The second time round, we ran a gallery called the Side Gallery, Photographic Gallery in Newcastle, and all of my work has probably been shown there first before it then travels on. And there was a book. I made a book as well, and I took the book back to the participants. And the film was screened on television. So I was going through the same process that you described, Nadir, that I would take the work back to the people at every stage, even in the selection of the photographs. And funnily, the one scene in the film Today I'm With You that shows me arguing about which picture, it was the only participant who didn't like my choice, because I had a more glamorous picture of her that she wanted to go forward. But she also became someone we was such a feisty, amazing woman. We wanted to star in the next film we were making, which we didn't, unfortunately, get the full funding for. But yeah, she was going to be fostered in that way. She didn't get her. Well, I did a little fashion show with her for the film, just to have some fun with her. But yeah, otherwise it was surprising how the people kind of homed in on the picture, same picture. I mean, I would take lots, obviously, and we just had to choose one for each participant. And it was quite canny how people would choose the same image as I would choose, because it was more of like a story. It was something. It wasn't just being falsely happy to the camera or presenting, showing your best side kind of thing, but because it had a narrative and people themselves were intrigued at the story that they had presented. So there was no problem there. Then alongside that, I would also record the stories, either from memory, in most cases actually from memory, and then I would take that story back to them and say, I want you to edit things out of it you don't want to go public, or you can add aspects so we can continue a conversation. So those stories that went into the book, although they're quite raw, often quite difficult stories, they were all final consent came from the participants. And sometimes one or two stories went under anonymous, but most of them actually under their own names. So as far as I could, I mean, some things I couldn't get like individual consent for. There was the prayer for Congo in the Today I'm With You film, where the priest assured that he has gained the consent from all the participants. I was allowed to film that on my own, that scene, which became quite an emotional scene. No, you were not. I was there, and I was there on my own, and I was the only white person there. And the only complaint I got was from the priest who was conducting that ceremony. He came to me in the end and he said, "Why didn't you film me?" Well, I did, but I didn't. I was more interested in the other participants. He was performing so splendidly, and he was disappointed that it wasn't all about him. But but yeah, I did try to get consent, but still things can go out of your control, and I won't go into that now. But when the film went on television, there were further kind of events took place, and at some point you just have to say, I've done my best, you know, with the best intentions in the world, but I can't control all the outcomes thereof, because people's lives continue, you know, when you stop on that project. The film remains, the work remains, and you know, you can't be you can't follow it till the end of your days. Although bike is following me to the end of my days, I can see now.
Thank you, Serka. I think we've lost Nadir temporarily. I think he's left the building.
Ellie's back there.
Ellie's back.
Yeah, I got frozen for about 5 minutes. Well, you all got frozen, so I logged out and logged back in. Maybe that's what he's doing.
Yeah. Whilst we're waiting for Nadir to come back, Will, you had a question.
Yeah, I did. It was a question for everyone, but I think that actually I can address it to Amber. But it comes out of an observation of something that happens in Amasu in Nadir's film. Oh, Nadir should be coming back now. Which is that I think there are some really lovely moments in the film where you get the sense that there's a realization amongst the local community, a real sophistication of understanding about the power of images and about the way in which those images can be used for political impact, but also the way in which those images can circulate and travel. You know, I'm thinking of not only the small studio that they have set up to communicate across social media in various ways about the activism that's going on against the mining company, but also the scene in the oasis where there are two men under a tree, and one is taking a photo and he's saying, oh, you know, put this on Facebook, and there's kind of real awareness of the way in which those images circulate. And I wanted to ask Nadir, but I can see he's not connecting there, about if you could talk a little bit more about that sophistication and understanding of working with the groups. But the question I had for Amber was whether, you know, I think Sirka actually sort of hinted at this in something she was saying earlier, but the question is really about the changes that you have observed in terms of the kind of a sophistication of an understanding of the power of the image, of the communities that you work with, or whether that sophistication was always there and it's just something that is amplified because of sort of the digital age we live in.
Yeah, can reply to maybe. I mean, it's an example, I think, of that. I mean, I think, yes, there's a huge growth in awareness of the detrimental effect of media coverage, which perhaps wasn't. I mean, it's interesting that, you know, Nadir talks about colonialism and people's understanding of the camera being behind the Legionnaires, and they saw it as the enemy. Well, I think that's very similar to what happened in the miners' strike, you know, where all the media was from behind the police lines. Nobody was shooting from the point of view of the pickets. And I mean, I think that the understanding that people gained through that, I mean, I think that, and this applies to a lot of different struggles, you know, if you've been through a struggle and then you've seen it, how it got portrayed in the mainstream media, you then have a completely different attitude after that to the media. And we have some really powerful stuff where people talked about how at the beginning of the miners' strike, you know, the miners really wanted them to talk to the cameras because they you know, they to get their point, you know, the experience across. And then when they saw what came back and they saw what was actually being shown and the story that was actually being told, they then became very, very suspicious about the media, and that affected us. I mean, it was a long time. In the end, I think it came back that because of all the work that we did to try to get their message out across, however that could be done in those days pre-internet, and got to trust us again, and then we would be, but they were very, very suspicious. So, like for instance, when Thatcher died, and there was Margaret Thatcher died, and there was a celebration in Easington, in the mining village here. We were the only film crew that were allowed in to film that, because they were so aware of the hostility that would be there from the media. So that's, I mean, I don't know if that's an example of what you were talking about, Will, but that's a sophistication that, but unfortunately, I think it doesn't it doesn't translate across generations. It's only if you've been through it yourself that you have that knowledge and that understanding of what the media is and the misuse of the media, and that can apply to social media as well now. I'm so horrified how little people realize, even people who've been through that in this community, they haven't passed that suspicion on to their children, you know, or the next generation haven't understood how they can be manipulated, and how their story is manipulated, and, you know, to terrible terrible political effect, much more so now because of the control of social media through money. I mean, that stories can be bought, you know, but point of view can be bought now. So, but yeah, I don't know. You can't replace personal experience, I don't think, in that way.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. Can I also kind of redirect the question to Nadir, Jamie, because Nadir, you dropped out. We were just talking about the sophisticated understanding of the local community, about the power of the image, and the ways in which I think in Amasu there's a real clear understanding of that. And I just wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit in the context of Amasu about the way in which the local Imidir community actually, you know, understood very, very well images and how they could connect to make their cause more, to amplify their cause globally.
I think that this was something that they already they recognized from the very beginning. I mean, the protest camp began in 2011, and I didn't get there until. I mean, I was still in university abroad. I didn't get back till 2015. So 2015 is when I make the first contact. So in those 4 years, they had already been filming and documenting their movement. They'd already been producing little videos they would put on YouTube. So there was this, and they recognized the power of journalism in protecting them. And they would seek out journalists. They would seek out, like I said earlier, international messaging to make sure that they had coverage abroad. So you find New York Times has written about it, Al Jazeera. You have France 24 who all written about this protest camp, and that's precisely what helped stop political imprisonment in the village. Thankfully, our state does care about a fake democratic image, so that using images, you can play that game with them and say, we have this over we have this over you. So that there was, the community does see that power, and when we talk about image making, and then in terms of culture, it's the same thing. They are already producing poems. We have a very traditional. We have Amazigh people have a very strong tradition of imtiazn, or as you'd say in English, bards or troubadours, who in the past would go from village to village bringing news of revolt against the colonizer, and so there's already this tradition that they carried on in the movement. They were producing these poems that that already expressed how they saw themselves, their condition, and basically adapting those poems to the cinematic medium. Like I said earlier, it's also about decolonizing our approach. So we have this, as filmmakers from colonized countries, we have this added burden of, okay, well, what is our cinematic language? How do we develop a cinematic language that's specific to this community? And this is something that I guess there's this discourse of universalism, of universal. You hear it a lot with filmmakers would say something like, "Oh, that my film is about the human condition," or "My film is a universal film that touches the world." And as filmmakers from the global south, we know those films don't work for our communities. You can't show this what they call in Cannes or a universal film to someone in Emeda. They wouldn't understand that cinematic language. So it's very important to look at well, first of all, look at our codes as colonized people, and then, of course, my codes, I'm from the north, they're from the south, their codes are different, so looking at their codes, their indigenous art, and looking at our own art history in order to construct our own cinematic language. In Europe, it's okay to be inspired by, you mentioned you were Renaissance paintings, your inspiration from Renaissance. Today, I'm with you. So on our end, we have to find inspiration in weaving and poetry and other references. So in terms of image making, we have to look at this so that when like I said earlier, so when the community watches it, it's the same codes. They understand the poetry, they understand the metaphor and the allegory, because it's their own, and you're just taking what's already there. That's why you can't even classify the kind of film. I don't think I could classify the films that I make as auteur films, because there is no auteur. Everybody's an auteur, and this is more in line with how our communities functioned before colonialism.
Thank you very much, Nadir. We're running a little short on time. I've got one last question, but Ellie, you want to respond? Go for it.
Oh, well, I just wanted to ask Nadir a particular thing about decisions that he made, or how they were made, and it sort of relates to what you were saying. But there was my favorite scene in Amusu was the scene where the women were making the bread, and it was interesting because I saw the film first without any subtitles, because I couldn't get the subtitles to work. So I watched about the first third of the film without any understanding of what people were saying, and then Jamie thankfully told me how to get the subtitles, so I watched it all again. And then I was just absolutely amazed by that scene, because it was a beautiful scene and I'd watched it and just thought, this is an amazing scene. But then when I heard what they were saying, and it was this whole analysis of what the current political situation in the camp and the village, and and talking all about that. And I had no idea that that's what she was talking about when I watched it the first time. And I just wondered whether, whose decision, like whether you just happened to capture that, or whether you had discussed what they were going to talk about, and whether that was what they wanted to talk about, or whether it's what you wanted them to talk about. And I mean, just this whole thing, because I mean, so often we have these decisions to make about how do you portray, because you didn't do any interviews in the film. I thought that was interesting too, that all the dialogue was between the people in the film, not to you or to the filmmaker, and yet you got so much out of those moments, those discussions between people. You understood so much about what was happening. So I just wondered how you did that, how you got that.
I'm glad you asked this question, because sometimes when earlier I was supposed to talk about the first question, and then I always make these divergences. So I'm glad you asked that. So it's actually for that scene. So I was talking about the agaro for writing, and in the agaro for writing, it's this big circle. It's just like any agaro, and everybody takes a turn to say what. I didn't come in with a script or a preset. I had an idea that I wanted to shoot something that had a structure of cultural seasons, so that it follows the time of the place. And I knew it had to be a collective film, it had to be collectively made, that it had to reveal it had to touch on certain points to confront the narrative of the states and the mining company. and to support some of the things the community was saying. But beyond that, I didn't want to set something too rigidly, because it has to be a collectively conceived. So everybody would take a turn and say what they thought should be in the film, and then after a while, you start to realize that that what the suggestions that they were making were actually things that they saw as their own contributions to the movement, and so you have the youth saying, for example, the young men would say, "Well, film us seeing the pickup truck. You have to film the pickup truck. It's what gets us water to the camp. Without it, it's its own character. So the pickup truck becomes a character in the film." And then you have the women saying, "Well, film us making bread, because the women, the whole camp lives off that bread. Sometimes they could go for days without nothing else but bread and tea. That's what they would eat." This is the contribution of these women to the movement. They saw that as their contribution. Or film us collecting herbs, and then once you have this collective film that's being produced collectively, conceived collectively, and then you have also these. Sorry, one more thing. Essentially, what you realize is that the suggestions that they were making is it reflects how history is made, in the sense that history is not made by individual heroes or they're made by lots of people who play little roles and add with tiny little gestures. And so that's exactly the structure that the film took. Is we took everything that people said, and they saw their contributions to be to this movement, to history, and it becomes the accumulation of these very small gestures, even as small as a dog at the protest camp becomes an act of militancy. And that's the idea, is that it's the accumulation of actions that changes history. It's not individual heroes. But then again, and so this is the overview, but scene by scene, individuals, of course, are being the ones that are filmed in that particular scene. So they have a say in their own scene. They have power in their own scene. And the one example of a mise en scène that was made by the people in front of the camera themselves is the scene where the little girl is coming up from the mountain, and she talks about her brother who just got imprisoned. So that scene was set up, was mise en scène by the woman who's singing. She said, "I'm going to sing, film you from here. Jamila's going to come up from the mountain, and then we're going to talk about this." And that thing had just happened. That imprisonment happened earlier that day. So even though it's a mise en scène, it's still very fresh. The young girl just lived that. The women just lived that. So it's kind of like, I mean, a lot of people talk about the Battle of Algiers, how it's only made a few years after independence, Algerian independence, and how people, even though they weren't professional actors, it was still raw emotion. It was almost documentary-like. So it's kind of like that in sometimes, but then you also have times when it's just, the camera is there at the right moment at the right time. So it's actually a combination of things. It's not all mise en scène, and if there is mise en scène, it can sometimes be. Also, sometimes I send what I call agents. So I send someone, for example, if it's difficult for me to communicate with one of the women who doesn't speak Darija, it speaks Tamazight, we have a problem of communication, or someone doesn't understand a concept that I'm trying to get at, I'll have one of the local film committee guys who are literate, because a lot of the people there are not literate, and I would explain to them what I'm trying to get at the scene, and then I would send them in, and then they would provoke that situation. So it's a conversation that happens with all of them before, and then if someone doesn't still get it, you have to get it to them from someone who's closer to them, who they know well. And I think that kind of it functions sort of like an interview without me being present, and it can sometimes give something more interesting than the traditional interview.
Thank you very much, Nadir. Fantastic. I think we should probably start kind of winding things down here, because I'm aware I've promised to keep things to an hour. So I have one last question for you both, which is kind of hopefully might serve to kind of summarize some of the many interesting things that we've been talking about here. And it's basically just there's a quote in Nadir's film Musu where someone is talking about an activist film group, and it made me think a lot about this notion of a folk cinema or a people cinema that our festival, the Folk Film Gathering, is very interested in, and all the kind of different articulations of that from different parts of the world, different parts of kind of cinema history, world history. And so I just wanted to read the quote to you both, and just to kind of for you to think about ways in which this quote resonates or doesn't resonate with your own work either. I'll maybe start with Amber and start. Pete, we haven't heard from you. I wonder if you'd be willing to. The quote is, "There is a struggle for the right of the people to cinema. Cinema is for everyone. It shouldn't be elitist. And cinema can be a tool in the hands of the people." I'm wondering, firstly, for Amber, to what extent those words, kind of thinking back over everything we've just talked about, resonate or don't resonate for you guys?
I mean, first of all, I'd just like to kind of respond to what Nadir was saying, because it's not a dissimilar kind of modus operandi that he uses. It doesn't differ that much from the way that we work. In fact, there are ways of manipulating situations to actually take it in a direction that you would like it to go. And it may well be an agent kind of provoking, almost from the side.
With the actors having their lines and then provoking a natural response from.
Yes, that's right. I mean, Seco, which Ellie, somebody referred to earlier on, very early drama film, where the union rules at the time for actors was that we could not give them lines, that they could appear in
the union actors.
If they weren't in the union, they could not have lines. But they could appear in the film so long as they were responding to what was going on in whatever conversation or scene or event that they were involved in. So, in a sense, it was forcing a kind of improvised response that may or may not have been have happened. But I think it was a genuine way of getting people to kind of express themselves in a way that they felt was a true representation of what was happening in their lives. I don't know whether you agree with that, Ellie. I think that.
But anyway, at least not.
Yeah.
Yes. I think the whole reason for us moving into drama was in a way that notion of being able to use dramatic situations to kind of get behind, into a different sort of reality, a more emotional reality of the people and their lives that we might know about, but we didn't want to just tell people that. We wanted to reveal it, through the people themselves. In a way, that's what Jamie's quote is about, I suppose. I mean, the cinema of the people. I mean, it's. I suppose that's always been Amber's credo, in a way, is that it wasn't about us. We weren't revealing our own secrets. We were revealing the secrets of the community. But in order to do that, it's a relationship. There's a relationship between you as filmmakers and the community. So it's interesting. But saying, it is, like Pete says, that there are manipulations, there are secrets, there are tricks. That you have. I think now there's a criticism of. Now more and more, there's an idea that you know, that you can't make a film about a community unless you give the community the tools themselves, and they have to make it. And maybe that is the future, but I think that what Amber have tried to do is to kind of lend our skills to people so that they can tell their story through us in a way. And I think there is a value in that, although I think that current sort of media politics might be going away from that. I don't know what Nadir thinks about that.
Oh, you're muted, Nadir.
Yeah, I think that there's an issue, I think, with something that's very similar to what environmentalists would call extractivism in terms of natural resource industries. The same thing sort of happens with communities and stories, and there can be what I call cultural extractivism as opposed to cultural appropriation, where people are going into communities, and yeah, there's this sort of, people are moving towards this direction of, yeah, let's do things with communities. Let's have communities take pictures of themselves. So this is becoming more and more common. But at the same time, because it's happening within a liberal or neoliberal framework, what it turns into is actually exploitation. Because if you were to give those tools to professionals to go and take pictures for you, you'd be paying a lot of money. But because you're giving it to people who don't understand, because you didn't take the time to really show them, and yeah, you show them how to use the tools technically. This is the issue. You find a lot of people doing technical workshops for communities to film themselves or photograph themselves, but there isn't this theoretical conversation about what the end is. What do you want to do with that in the end? It's just about extracting, and that's it. And then you hear it when you go to the festivals. You hear people talking about. I once heard a producer and I can't remember which festival, saying something like, I can't remember the exact phrase, but I remember just being shocked. But they talk about people as, and you say this in Today I'm With You, subjects. This is a huge problem with the term subject. But they talk about them as if they're like things to be taken and profited. I don't know how to, I can't remember the exact wording, but it really pissed me off because I hear it a lot. And so they're talking about markets, and they're talking about, is there a market for this subject? Oh, this character is going to be so good for this market. And it's not about what does that subject want from this. Maybe they have something to say. I mean, this is just it's reflective of how, even if we want to do something, if we wanted to involve communities within a certain framework, that can never give the results that we want. So we have to be quite clear, and this is why, like, when I have Amusu, I try to produce paratexts around the film, so writing essays and articles around the film, so that I protect it from being used in a way that I don't want it to be used. It's supposed to be a statement against capital, against environmental destruction, and I can't let it be absorbed by something else. So I think paratexts also play a role in protecting our works. And I see Amber kind of does this also. I saw on Vimeo you have a lot of paratexts in forms of video and short films around that bring up the films from the 70s and revisit the communities. I saw The Art of Shipbuilding, which is really a great film, and it reminded me of the way that I use poetry in Musu as well. So I think building these little clusters of works that can stand without someone being able to take them out of this is very important.
Great, thank you all very much. I think we should probably round things off there for today. But thank you all very much indeed for participating. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Serka. Thank you, Nadir. Thank you, Will. I'm going to switch off the recording now.
Okay.